think what we'll see is that changing stereotyping and prejudice is a complex topic. It's not straightforward, it's not easy. Um, and like the topic itself, we're going to see that there aren't simple answers. So buckle your seatbelts and we'll cover the basics of stereotyping and prejudice. The last lecture in the first unit, when we're looking at stereotyping processes, theories, outcomes, and whether you can change stereotyping and prejudice. The exam is next week. After that exam, we're going to take up the second unit of the course when we're going to look at what are the consequences of stereotyping and prejudice for people who have to face it. Looking at what it's like to face stereotyping and prejudice on a regular basis. But for today, we're still going to stick with what are processes around stereotyping and prejudice that lead it to occur or not occur. I think one of the things that we have learned is that societal prejudice has reduced, but explicit prejudice is still common in at least a fifth of the people in the US, and implicit prejudice is even more common. So what should we do about this very prevalent, very widely prevalent behavior and attitudes of stereotyping and prejudice? Can we eliminate it? I think we're going to see that eliminating it may be kind of a utopian pipe dream. Eliminating stereotyping and prejudice is not going to be easy. I don't look for a decline in the significance of prejudice, stereotyping and prejudice, or its elimination, certainly in my lifetime, but I don't think in any of your lifetimes either. Can we fight it? Yes, and I think we're going to see what today that actually stereotyping and prejudice, one of the key points to fighting it is acknowledging it and doing your best to overcome it, and setting up conditions that you can overcome it. And long-term strategies with considerable effort to fight stereotyping and prejudice. So, how do we do this? How do we fight stereotyping and prejudice? Well, let's return to the Devine 1989 set of experiments. If you remember, in this set of experiments, I argued this was kind of the beginning of implicit stereotyping. But I think you can also, of research on implicit stereotyping, I think you can also see it as the beginning of an understanding of what you do with stereotyping and prejudice. How do people who are low in prejudice actually combat it? Because if you think of the logic of this study, you'll see that it's not just a matter of eliminating stereotyping and prejudice. That's not what low prejudice people do. What she argued is that everyone knows the stereotypes. So it's not like we're likely to ever have a society in which people don't know stereotypes about lots of different groups. That's likely to be present. And she also argued that everyone automatically activates the stereotypes about groups that are commonly stereotyped within society. Now, as we saw, not everyone automatically activates it, but it's real easy to activate the stereotype. It may not always be automatic. There may be individual differences in how easy it is to happen. But in a way, Devine was right that people do quite easily, maybe not quite automatically and maybe not all the time, but people do quite easily activate stereotypes about many groups in society that are commonly stereotyped. And what she argued separated low prejudice people, is that they control the application of the stereotype. They actually fight back against the stereotype. They try not to stereotype. And I want to present an important model that explains how relatively implicit prejudices, the kind of things that Devine talked about as automatically activating stereotype, doesn't always lead to explicit prejudice. And when it will be more likely to lead to prejudice, when it won't, the role that people's motivations play in that process. And Fazio calls this the mode model. And the mode model um, it really stands for, it's an acronym. The M stands for motivation, and the O stands for opportunity, determines expression of any thought that you have. So your motivation and opportunity, they determine expression. And so it stands for, that's what it stands for. And with prejudice, that means we can look at whether activation of stereotypes and prejudice determines the expression of prejudice by examining how motivation and opportunity work together to affect that expression. So, motivation to control prejudice responses will determine whether stereotypes and prejudice that is activated will lead to prejudice, but only if there's opportunity for this motive to operate. Try and show you in a diagram, maybe it's a little more simple. We could think that stereotype activation, we could think that that automatically leads to prejudice expression. If you activate a stereotype, you'll see a prejudice expression. But we know it's not that simple. Motivation can come in, just like in divine study, where low prejudice people are motivated to not allow the activation to lead to actual prejudice expression. But in order for that motivation to limit stereotype activation becoming prejudice expression, it's only going to happen if there's opportunity for the motivation to work. So motivation requires all kinds of energy, thought, focus. When those things don't happen, when there isn't that opportunity for motivation to influence the process, then stereotype activation will be more likely to lead to prejudice expression. So in terms of Devine's model, what she argued is everyone automatically activates the stereotype. Now, does that lead to prejudice expression? Well, not among low prejudice people, because they're motivated to control the stereotype. They're motivated not to let that automatic activation determine their response to other people. Prejudice people don't have that motivation to control stereotyping, so they're much more likely to get prejudice expression. And what's also really important, though, is that people have an opportunity to limit that automatically activated stereotype. And in that study, if you remember, everybody read a paragraph about this man named Donald. And when they read this paragraph about the man named Donald, which is kind of, they were judging whether he was aggressive or not. And it's funny, this study would probably never work nowadays, because everybody, when they heard Donald, would think Donald Trump, and they might think automatically aggressive, especially after the debate this week. But that's a side note. At this point in time, people weren't thinking about Donald, but they didn't know it was about prejudice either. That's the point. When that measure, when they asked people how aggressive Donald was, there's no indication of Donald's race. The activation of the stereotype was subliminal. People couldn't see it. So there's no opportunity to control prejudice expression. So they ended up describing Donald as aggressive when they'd been presented with stereotypic words related to blacks. And the mode model would say that happens not for a couple reasons. For high prejudice people, because they're not motivated not to let it influence their prejudice expression, but for low prejudice people, because they don't have an opportunity to limit their prejudice expression, because they don't realize this situation is about prejudice. And there are lots of times when we have reduced opportunity. So even if we're motivated not to allow the activation of stereotypes, which are very, very common, and again, we're not saying everybody activates them all the time, but they're very, very common, to lead to prejudice expression, we got to have opportunity, even if we're motivated. And there's lots of times when we don't have opportunity. You're tired and have a hard time using your motivations when you're tired. You're thinking about lots of things and distracted and have a hard time summoning your motivation. You have to make decisions very quickly and don't have time to think about your motivations. You don't realize your responses have anything to do with prejudice. All of these things have been shown to reduce the correction for automatically activated attitudes leading to prejudice. People who are motivated not to be prejudiced, when these things happen, those motivations don't operate, and you see much more prejudice expression. This is why thinking of somebody just high or low in prejudice is only a piece of the puzzle. In Devine's model, and in this mode model, if we want to think about it, what's really happening is high and low prejudice is the motivation not to be prejudiced. And that doesn't determine everything. Even people who are low in prejudice and really don't want to be prejudiced, that means that's what their motivation is. When they're too tired, when they're thinking a lot about things and they're distracted, when they have to make decisions quickly, when they don't even think that the situation is all about race, you're going to see prejudice expression. Okay. Does this, let me give you an example of a study done here. Russ Fazio from the mode model is also from Ohio State. If you're fortunate enough to have a course with him later, you may very well learn. He teaches an attitudes class where he talks much more about the mode model. But he also did a clever piece of research related to the mode model, and in some ways capturing it even better than I was describing the Devine study. What he had people do is during the math survey in REP, he had them complete a measure that he created, the motivation to control prejudice. That's the motivation part, obviously. Are people motivated to not be prejudiced? And it included questions like, it's important to me that people not think I'm prejudiced. I feel guilty when I have a negative thought or feeling about a black person. Going through life worrying about whether you might offend someone is just more trouble than it's worth. That one was reverse scored. There's a whole set of these, about 20, that he used to measure people's motivation not to be prejudiced. Then he had people come in and they completed the stereotype activation measure that we described in the explicit and implicit lecture. And remember, what this measure does is it gives people a bunch of pictures of blacks and white people, and it has people have a bunch of words that are stereotypic or not. And the question is, and then they're presented first the pictures and then the words, and it's supposed to be a memory task, and then they're presented both at the same time. And the question is, do the black faces speed up the processing of the stereotypic words? An indication that there's an association between the stereotype, as you know, in the words, as exemplified by the words, and the faces. So he looks at whether people are automatically activate stereotypes easily or not. And then he had people return 3 to 5 weeks later. They viewed 32 photos, half of which were black and half of which were white, and they rated them on stereotypic traits. And those traits included things like intelligent, industrious, likable, honest, and reliable. And what they actually found, so 8 of the photos were matched black-white pairs, so they're really concerned about the rating of those 8 photos. The rest were kind of fillers, so it wasn't so obvious what was going on. And did people stereotype the black images, the people represented by the black pictures, more than the white pictures? Well, it was really determined by motivation to control prejudice, and whether people didn't have as much opportunity to correct for any prejudiced thoughts they might have automatically activated. And what you find is that motivation had a strong impact, but only when they weren't their mental resources weren't tied up by doing another task. So a great example of really the mode model in practice. Tell me what these people are like. All you know is a picture. You can see whether they're black or white. And do people say stereotypic things? Well, they generally don't. If they're motivated to control prejudice, they generally do. if they're not motivated to control prejudice. But even the people who are motivated to control prejudice show some evidence of prejudice when their mental resources are tied up from another task they're doing at the time. So, can we change stereotypes? The answer is that it's really, really hard to change stereotypes, particularly these automatic associations that we talked about when we were talking about implicit bias. Very, very few studies, as we're going to see, have been able to change those sorts of associations that's been developed over time, really from living in a society that includes lots of stereotypic and racist images. What is typically more effective is to recognize stereotypes and actively fight against them. What this research really suggests is it's super important that people are motivated not to stereotype. But so many studies have tried to change implicit stereotypes, but the evidence is small. And really what's important is fighting against stereotyping and creating opportunities to actually be able to use that motivation. But we still can't expect change in the implicit stereotypes. They don't really seem to change. So what practically are we going to do? So can we change these stereotypes? The answer is, one answer is an old and important one. And that's going to take us backwards to older research in social psychology that's looked at changing stereotyping and prejudice, and that's increasing contact between members of different groups. And what I think we're going to see is this is an important way to A, move people's motivations not to stereotype and be prejudiced against others, and B, maybe over time actually change those implicit stereotypes and prejudice, which in almost all experimental work, there's very, very little evidence that that can actually happen. But over time, with contact, we're going to see a study at the end that suggests that that might be one way to do it. Okay. The contact hypothesis has been around for a long time. It was absolutely central to the civil rights movement, and particularly to ending segregation, and particularly segregation of schools. In The Nature of Prejudice, Gordon Allport defined contact. These are the conditions that really need to be made. Contact between members of different groups who aren't getting along, groups that are separated from one another. You need to have equal status between the groups in the situation. You need to have common goals. You need to have intergroup cooperation between the groups, and you need the support of authorities, law, or custom. Now, that's a lot to ask, and it's certainly in the civil rights era, very rarely was this ever seen. If you're talking about desegregation of schools and putting black and white kids together in schools where they in the South or even in the North, equal status between the groups was unlikely. Whites had higher status. That was the way society was set up. Did they have common goals? Sometimes, and we're going to see common goals are really important. And we're going to see that intergroup cooperation is really important for establishing and developing those common goals. And the support of authorities, law, or custom, that was all over the place when we look at segregation. Sometimes there was great support for ending segregation. Sometimes there was great opposition. And certainly custom, law, and authorities, when we look at the civil rights era, it wasn't always there. Now, this idea of the contact hypothesis was central for the Brown versus Board of Education that desegregated schools in the U.S. There was a social science brief, and Allport was one of the people who signed on, but not the most important by any means. He wrote this book, The Nature of Prejudice, that became quite popular, sold well. He certainly was a central figure, but not the central figure. And that social science brief argued that segregation leads to black children learning that they aren't respected, white children learning to be prejudiced, and blockage in the communication and interactions between groups. Basically, the social science brief argued that segregation could never be separate from equal because it would subjugate black children and to white children by the very nature of the way that segregation occurred, and it would prevent the opportunity to reduce prejudice that the communication and intergroup and interactions between groups could provide. So social scientists argued segregation was crucial. When we look at Brown versus Education and its effects, the arguments were it's going to be good for the schooling of black children, and it's going to make whites less prejudiced. And basically, when we look at the effects of desegregation, it does promote favorable attitudes between the races, and it does actually it does reduce prejudice against whites, and it increases academic performance among blacks when we look at the effects of school desegregation. But really interestingly, Alport's conditions, and if we go back and look at those, favorable attitudes and friendly, got to go back one more slide, equal status between the groups in the situation, common goals, intergroup cooperations, and the support of authorities, law, or custom really make contact work better. Okay. Now, if you notice in those conditions, one of them really it's two when we look back at them. It's cooperation, intergroup cooperation, and common goals. Well, there's actually an even older social psych experiment done by Muzaffar Sherif in the 1930s and 40s that actually highlighted the importance of having common goals that create intergroup cooperation. And these sorts of goals, I think, are crucial to making contact work well. What Sherif did in these experiments is he brought together boys that were going to a summer camp in Oklahoma. And like many summer camps, he divided the boys up into two groups. And what he wanted to look at is how he could create animosity between these two groups and then how he could overcome it. So it really wasn't hard for him to make the two groups hate each other. One year they were the Eagles and the Rattlers. I like to use that term, even though he changed the name each year, just to add a little life to the story. He did this over about 8 years in the summer camp and wrote a book summarizing all the results. So what he would typically do is he'd divide the boys into the two groups, just randomly into the two groups. But then he would set it up so that one group would take advantage of the other group. One of the ways he did this early on is both of the groups were sent on a hike, and they were supposed to go to a common place for supper later that evening. Now, he set it up so that one group got to the supper about an hour before the other group got to the supper. And he purposely set it up so that half the food was really quite nice. I mean, the hot dogs it was hot dogs and hamburgers, but they were cooked properly. The buns were normal. The chips were normal. The sweets for dessert were there and could be eaten. Not surprisingly, the group that got there first eats the good food. The other food was burnt hot dogs and hamburgers, squish buns, crumpled potato chips into little tiny fragments, and he figured out he didn't have to do much with the sweets but leave them out and let the boys take as much as they wanted. The group that got there first ate all the good food, ate all the sweets, the brownies and cookies and so forth, left the group that got there late the burnt, squished hot dogs and hamburgers, the crumpled up crumbs of potato chips, and not much else. Not surprisingly, the group that came in second, got there second, thought that was patently unfair and were quite angry that they were left with, not such a good supper. The next day, he would switch it around. They were playing soccer. and it turned into, a series of games, a best of 7 in soccer. Somewhere, usually in the first game, but certainly in the second game, depending on the year, it became quite obvious that the group that got screwed over the night before, on the supper, the refs were just dramatically favoring them. They could do whatever they want. If the other team was dribbling the ball up, they could just kick the kid in the shins and steal the ball and run down and score. And not surprisingly, when the ref allows that sort of behavior, much of that behavior occurs. And of course, now the Eagles, who had taken all the food, were getting the brunt of the really nasty, somewhat aggressive behavior of the Rattlers, who were perfectly happy with kicking them in the shin and stealing the ball. He went on with several activities like this. It only took 2 days, and every year within 2 days, every kid on the Eagles hated every kid on the Rattlers, and every kid on the Rattlers literally said they hated every kid in the Eagles. So how'd you fix this? Is this just the way he's going to let it go? Well, actually, Sharif had some ideas about how to fix this sort of animosity between groups. And it turns out to be very important for contact. What he did is he developed activities that were what he called a superordinate goal. And to be a superordinate goal, an activity had required both groups to cooperate in order to achieve something they both wanted. And he carefully set these up later on in the weeks to smooth things out between the two groups. So one year, what he did is he cut down a tree and had it drop over the road out of the camp when they were going to the movies. They all wanted to go to the movies. At that time, that was really a treat. It was during the Great Depression. Things weren't going so well. They all wanted to go to the movies. The only way they could move the tree is if they all worked together to move the tree. Great example of a superordinate goal. The only way they can achieve their goal, which they share in common, is if they work together to achieve it. Another year, a little bit crazy, but he actually did this. He set one of the buildings on fire. Now, presumably, they all had the goal that they didn't want the whole camp to burn down. The only way to achieve that goal is work together with a bucket brigade, with buckets of water to throw on the fire and put out the building that Sharif had caught on fire. These sorts of superordinate goals, and what make them different than just common goals, is they can't be achieved unless the groups work together. Lots of common goals can be achieved by one group on their own, or by working together. Those are good, but superordinate goals are unique. They require competition between the groups. So that was important, and an important aspect of contact. Contact works much better with superordinate goals, and it makes sense. Two of Alport's conditions: intergroup cooperation and common goals. Fairly recently, in 2006, Pettigrew and Trop reviewed 515 studies on contact. And as they summarized the results mathematically over all these studies, it became crystal clear that contact does work to reduce prejudice. And not only that, contact works better if Alport's conditions are met. If you have intergroup contact, or if you have intergroup cooperation, if you have supporting norms, if you have equal status, those conditions are what actually allow contact to work. Well, it works fairly well without all those conditions. It works better if those conditions are met. So, as we've studied contact, not only does it work, we realized how it works. And one of the problems that often happens, even when after segregation is ended, is that people don't have contacts even if they're in the same environment. It's often called self-segregation, where people just sit together with people from their own group. And it turns out that contact works so much better if you have cross-group friendships. And it turns out, as important as Alport's conditions are, what they really seem to set up is the opportunity for groups to have, for friendships develop among people of different groups. They're among the most important predictors of contact working. And friendships that involve lots of time and lots of self-disclosure, really deep friendships, work better at reducing prejudice than more shallow friendships. And in fact, you can even do this experimentally. In a study by Wright and his colleagues, he set it up so that people had 8-week sessions where they were set up to develop friendships over those 8-week sections, 8 weeks of sessions between groups that were either of the same group or different groups. And that contact significantly reduced prejudice on campus. They did this at University of California, Santa Cruz, and another example of how friendships really matter. So can we, in addition to the Wright study, can we test this experimentally? Well, it turns out that study has been done right here at Ohio State. And Natalie Shook and Russ Fazio, who we heard about earlier, they did this study. And how did they go about testing it? Well, they had white freshmen at OSU were assigned to have either a white or a black roommate. So they were randomly assigned. It's an experiment. And they were set up in the dorms. It turns out it's not too different than how people do it. They just made sure that they had people identified and they were randomly assigned to either a black or a white roommate. And these are the sorts of things that they measured at the beginning of the term. How the roommates got along with each other, satisfaction with each other, how many activities they did together, how much time they spent together, how comfortable they were with each other's friends. They took the bona fide pipeline measure that we described in the last lecture on implicit stereotyping. I described it a bit earlier. Again, it's the association between pictures of black people with stereotypes. How much do seeing the pictures of the black stereotypes speed up their identification of words related to the stereotype? They have explicit measures, including intergroup anxiety, which turns out to be an important one. Kind of how anxious do you feel when you're spending time with members of the other group? And they measured this at the beginning of the quarter and the end of the quarter. We have semesters now, but back in 2008, or really this study was 2006, Ohio State had quarters instead of semesters. Okay, so the big results were that white students who had a black roommate had more positive evaluation of blacks, even on that implicit bona fide pipeline measure. Now, and they also showed lower anxiety. Now, those are the big storyline. Here, we actually see implicit evaluations change. Notice this is a whole year of interacting with somebody a whole lot who's your roommate in the dorm. And we do see changes. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that that the roommates got along great. Actually, the white-black pairs didn't get as well as white-white pairs. They got along fairly well, but they certainly did not become best friends typically. It was unusual for that to happen. But they still got along, and they learned to live together, and they developed some sort of friendship through that contact. It's not as if it was a perfect relationship. And I think this is a great example of how contact often goes. Unless you carefully set up the situation, contact will sometimes lead to friendship, sometimes won't. Sometimes will work well at lowering stereotyping and prejudice, sometimes won't. This they just let happen as it naturally happened, as two roommates either get along or don't get along. It does suggest, though, that if we're going to look at changing stereotyping and prejudice, not only do we have to be motivated, not only do we have to create opportunities and make sure we have an opportunity to use that motivation to not engage in prejudice expression, but we have to be in it for the long haul. If we really want to have impact on implicit stereotyping and prejudice, it's not something that's going to happen in an hour in a lab. It's something that's going to happen over the year of interacting with somebody, hundreds and thousands of times. Um, Fighting stereotyping and prejudice is going to take motivation, effort, work, thought, focus, and time and energy. That's really what changing stereotyping and prejudice is all about. Okay, so let's summarize. If we want to combat stereotyping and prejudice, we can take a two-pronged approach. First, we need to recognize how common and pervasive stereotyping is, even at an implicit level, and we need to consciously fight against it, developing the motivation and opportunity to do so. Second, we need to develop good contact between members of different groups. Friendships are crucial for contact to work well. But keep in mind, it works even if the friendships aren't great. Most of the roommate friendships weren't great in the Shook and Fazio study. But it works especially well when friendships are good. I hope you've enjoyed this unit of the course. Looking forward to moving to the next one. Looking forward to chatting with each of you during the exam next week. Have a good weekend.